We Burnettes are an animal-loving family. We have two dogs, Lizzie and Stella, excited every time we come home, as if they thought, really, for this time we might be gone for good. The little one loves to cuddle. We also have two cats, Cosmo and Olivia. The cats are able to hide their excitement when we come through the door. Though, they like to cuddle too, on their own terms. Thank you very much, that's all. One of them has adopted our son. The other seems to have chosen our daughter as her person. It is adorable. And then there's Shadow the bearded dragon. A lizard, basically. He's adorable in his way too. But he does not wag his tail when we come through the door. When we walk by his aquarium, he kind of gives us the side eye. He sees the world mainly through the lens of fight or flight, always assessing whether what's around him is friend or foe. And as my wife found out when she was trying to get him to take some medicine and he clamped down on her fingernail, he can shift us from the friend column into the foe column in a split second, especially when he's anxious. He is considerably less cuddly than our other critters. There is a reason people talk about lizard brain. Reptile brains are pretty much restricted, as I understand it, I'm no expert, but restricted to the limbic system, a system that we have too. As Dr. Joseph Tronkale said recently in Psychology Today, it is in charge, this system, of fight, flight, feeding, fear, freezing up, and fornication. Maybe we need not worry about the last one right now. But fight, flight, fear, freezing up. Have you been on Facebook lately? There are posts that suggest that we should not normalize the incoming president. I agree. At one level, we need to stay alert, I think, is the overarching message, and maybe that's true now more than ever in my lifetime. But we do not have the capacity, friends, to be over anxious all the time. We must find ways to handle anxiety, including for some of us just ignoring the news for a while. But for some, even to suggest that sounds blasphemous, cause for exclusion from the group called progressives. And then there's the other side, which is arguing that things are about to get a whole lot better because of this election. And I've seen some conservatives who voted for Trump try to say, hey, I don't want him to cut my health care. And for many conservatives, that is cause to be excluded from the group called conservative. This is what anxiety, magnified by the megaphone of social media, can do in a culture. We're in our corners. This is, I think, a precarious time for our families. Anxiety is being passed from person to person as pack animals that we humans are. We take our cues from one another. And as retired counselor and pastor Roland Richardson has written, the most common way of controlling anxiety within self and protecting ourselves from a sense of threat is to emotionally distance ourselves for some period of time from those people and situations we find anxiety-provoking. I've done that recently. And I keep asking myself, can progressives and Trump voters be in meaningful relationships? Can they be in the same families and still talk about serious things? It all reminds me of one of Rabbi Edwin Friedman's parables. Rabbi Friedman, though I've never met him, has been for years a spiritual guide for me. He took the theory of the family as an emotional system, rather than a series of cause and effect relationships, the family as an entire system. He applied that to congregations. Here, with some editing, is his somewhat lengthy parable called Panic. There was a row of dominoes standing in a long, narrow line that circled back on itself. All the dominoes knew that if ever one lost its balance, all would have trouble keeping theirs. Now and then something happened that shook them, and some wobbled more than others, but they were always able to rebalance, and the dreaded, unstoppable chain reaction never began. Until one day it happened. It was number 10,101. Number 10,101 teetered, shook, pivoted on its corner, righted itself, and then fell flat against its neighbor. Its neighbor, 10,100, was so stunned that it immediately fell against its neighbor, and that sequence repeated itself at least several hundred times before all the dominoes recognized just how bad things were. As the process continued, some gave in without a fight. Others pretended it wasn't happening. A few became so anxious that they fell over before it was their time, so that you know these people too. Maybe like me, you've been that person. So that here and there, the tipping was being replicated in more than one place along the line. Things were becoming frantic. As the wave moved on, each domino gathered all its energy to hold or push back its falling neighbor, to react. But it was to no avail. The force was just too much for each individual domino's weight and size. To hold up one neighbor would have been difficult enough, but to fight the accumulating movement, this energy that was growing, was out of the question. Each domino that remained standing asked itself, what can I do to fight this plague-like process moving toward me? Some tried to calculate the power in ergs of energy against the rest mass of their own weight. Others wondered if some aerodynamic innovation could stop it. Still others considered the possibility that they could help their neighbors stem the tide if they could bring their own strength to greater, hitherto unimagined peaks. They had read about women whose children were trapped under a car and they lift the car. Several thought of sacrificing themselves for the greater good by falling before their turn, in the misguided hope that they would create a fire line which could not be crossed. But inevitability prevailed, and it was becoming hopeless to think that anything could stop all the falling when suddenly things stopped. They stopped with such resounding force and suddenness that at first the cumulative energy created a backlash. A ricochet occurred that actually reversed the process, and the dominoes began to go in the other direction, straightening up again, only to fall the other way. This continued at the same rate as the previous direction, past the starting point, running right through the original 10,101 and mowing down the remainder of those previously untouched, until once again the last one fell against the other side of the domino that had not gone down. Again, the process abruptly reversed itself, now in the original direction, but somewhat spent now. The energy being expended was just enough to push each in succession into an upright position without bowling it over. The verse and converse happened so fast that before any of the dominoes had time to consider what had happened, all were basically standing erect again, quivering here and there, but basically stable. Eventually, they all began to look at the point where things had turned. What had happened? Which one had stopped the falling and how? What they found was a domino no different in size or shape or weight or color or density or any other visible characteristic. No prosthesis or artifice propping it up. The entire line was stunned, and they slowly began to realize what they owed to this one domino. They all wanted to know, how did you do it? What formula did you use? What did you understand about the nature of this energy? The domino that did not domino just said, I'm not sure what the difference was. All I can say is that while each of you kept trying to hold your neighbor up, my concern was that I did not go down. Friedman was not suggesting here that we give up on doing good work in the world. And if you know me at all, neither am I. You've heard me preach from this spot that we have lots of work to do on immigration, on LGBTQ rights, on voting rights, and more. What he was prescribing is that in times of great anxiety, we come to know who we really are. Rather than be defined by the people, the energy that's shifting back and forth and back and forth. Who are we? And then he wrote later, we can actually do more good. We can be a more stabilizing force in the various systems in which we operate. If we know our core values, if that's our focus, then if we're simply being pushed around by the anxiety of others or thoughtlessly joining in the anxiety even of our own people, our own herd, whatever that means, this is not the time to flail. This is the time to be crystal clear about our values, then act on them. So here's what I hope we can all do. I hope each of us can decide, who do I want to be in the world that exists right now? What must I work for? And what are the important relationships in my life? And how do I want to behave toward those people even when they disagree with me, even when, to me, they're being obnoxious? As President Obama said this week, the only thing that is the end of the world is the end of the world. For the most part, outside cases of abuse, it is most healthy to stay connected to our loved ones. And staying connected is much easier for us when we're centered in our own values. When someone else's tipping domino causes us not to panic and tip ourselves, but to say, actually, I don't agree. Or say more if we decide. If we decide. That's the thing I think about taking care of and knowing ourselves, of, if you will, putting on our own oxygen mask first. It opens up a world of new strategies. I can choose to argue or not to argue. I'm not dragged around by a ball of anxiety in my gut that is magnetically drawn to other people's anxiety. I may even be able to find a way to be playful in difficult situations. Rabbi Friedman said, playfulness can get you out of a rut more successfully than seriousness. But playfulness is not possible when I'm thoughtlessly joining the panic of the people around me. In these anxious times, let us know ourselves, commit to our core principles, especially the principle of love. Stay connected to people who disagree with us. There, I think, is the possibility of true transformation. I came across a lovely example of this in a story shared on Facebook by Dustin Jones. Dustin is a former member of this congregation who now teaches at Cornell and lives in Ithaca, New York. I share this story with his permission. He wrote, "Love is the answer to many of life's challenges. I finally met my grandfather 15 years ago. He was 70. I was already grown, 30, married, 2 kids, and practicing law. We had never met because he had disowned my mom and refused to accept her interracial relationship or her quote-unquote half-breed children. He had harbored deep-rooted racism his whole life. He said, just don't mix the races. That's just how I was raised." Dustin writes, "My mom never disparaged him, but simply described him as a cold, lonely old man. I never had hard feelings toward him, but accepted he was from a very different generation and would hopefully change over time. After I finally met him, I took it upon myself just to love him. Love as a verb," Dustin says. Period. I wanted him to see the world through a different lens, starting with me. He thought I would reject or resent him for his 30 years' absence. No, that was his loss. He missed out. That was in the past. Now, Dustin writes, I just love him. I also taught his great-grandkids to love him unconditionally. It took patience, time, but now he's a changed man. Grandpa Jones cannot get enough of his great-grandkids. They think he's pretty special too. We're all better people because love always wins. And he concludes, after the MLK Day march yesterday, we went to lunch with Grandpa Jones and told him all about it. Maybe someday we'll get him to join us. Friends, in these anxious times, let us not just react. As did the marchers yesterday, clearly. Let us speak with strong voices to who we are, to the values that we cherish and will protect. Let us be dominoes that, though shaken, do not fall. May we be just so.